Hi, good afternoon and good morning to everybody. Welcome to this webinar. We will be starting shortly in about 5 more minutes. So thank you very much for your patience.
Alfredo, I think we can start.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Denise. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody. Welcome to the webinar titled Different Journeys to Develop a Legal Framework to Reduce Methane Emissions from the Oil and Gas Industry. It has been organized by the Climate and Clean Air Coalition and in collaboration with Clean Air Task Force. I would just like to give a few instructions before we begin and practical information about this webinar. Today, this will be the agenda that we are following. Giving opening remarks, we have Alice Alpert from the U.S. State Department. Then we will have Jonathan Banks from Clean Air Task Force and our country presentations from Asmau Jibril from Nigeria and Dora Lopez from Mexico. We're also very happy to be having the International Energy Agency represented by Tomás Oliveira and the European Commission represented by Brendan Devlin. Finally, the closing remarks will be given by Denise San Valentin from the CCAC Secretariat. Everyone is muted by default. If you have a question, please write them in the Q&A box and make sure you indicate who the question is for. Resource persons may respond to your question through chat even while the meeting is ongoing. Prior to the panel discussion, if there is time, the chair may read out some of the questions and allow speakers to respond. If you would like to take the floor and provide your comments as part of the discussion, please raise your hand using the WebEx function as shown in this slide. Finally, this webinar is being recorded, so please feel free to share with others who missed it. Presentations and a link to the recording will be shared after the webinar. With this, thank you very much for your attention, and I will be handing the floor to Alice.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you very much for the opportunity to open this webinar and for the CCAC's leadership in reducing short-lived climate pollutants. My name is Alice Alpert, and I sit in the Climate Office at the U.S. Department of State. President Biden's Special Envoy for Climate, John Kerry, former Secretary John Kerry, is relentlessly focused on keeping a safer future within reach below 1.5 degrees of warming. And as we know, the CCAC's own global methane assessment shows that rapid global methane reductions could avoid more than 0.2 degrees C of warming by 2050. And the world, more broadly, is now recognizing that methane is by far the top priority short-lived climate pollutant to tackle. But to keep 1.5 degrees within reach and prevent dangerous warming, deep methane reductions are as important as carbon dioxide reductions in the near term. And the fossil fuel industry represents 1/3 of anthropogenic methane emissions. And it's also the sector with the highest potential for low or even negative cost reductions. So tackling these emissions are key to slow the rate of global warming in the short term as efforts continue to decarbonize the energy system by adopting cleaner forms of energy. Specifically, regulations for leak detection and repair, or LDAR, I'm sure that we will be speaking a lot about this, are a key tool in creating an enabling environment for methane reductions and recovering a valuable product. The Biden administration is currently moving to put forward standards to control leaks from oil and gas facilities. And through the Advanced Research Projects Agency for Energy, or ARPA-E, the U.S. Department of Energy is developing advanced technologies to reduce methane emissions from all sectors, including energy. So the U.S. looks forward to continuing to engage in the CCA's work in this area and to facilitate country-specific policies and regulations to address these emissions. With that, I extend a warm welcome to the participants and thanks to organizers of the webinar, and wish us all a productive hour and a half. Thank you.
Thanks, Alice, for those remarks. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. My name's Jonathan Banks. I'm the International Director for Methane at the Clean Air Task Force, and it's great to be with you all today. I'm going to share my screen now. Try that again. Okay, are you guys seeing my screen?
Yes.
And full screen?
Yep.
Okay, awesome. Great. So as Alfredo mentioned, we're here to talk about the different pathways to developing a legal framework for methane emissions in the oil and gas sector. And we're very lucky to have a number of countries here that are on that pathway or have already completed that path. And so it's really exciting. We've got a good collection of folks that can give a great perspective on what that means for them. There's lots of commonalities between nations that are working on this issue. But of course, in every nation, every nation's unique, and the policies have to be adapted to the realities of that nation. But the big thing I think is important to know is that there is so much that we can all learn from each other as we try to reduce methane emissions. There's a long history on methane policy in the oil and gas sector. It goes back to really 1993 when a program called Natural Gas Star was launched. And it was launched not to reduce methane emissions to protect the climate or anything like that. It was actually launched to reduce the waste of natural gas. It was launched in the United States at a time when there wasn't a whole lot of natural gas in the United States, and there was a lot of discussion about importing natural gas. And the program was launched to develop technologies and practices to reduce the waste of gas that was escaping to the atmosphere or being flared. The technologies, the practices that Natural Gas Star developed helped kind of set the stage for a lot of the work that is being done today to reduce emissions. Then in the early 2000s, the science of short-lived climate pollutants first started coming out, and nations begin to realize the impact of methane emissions on climate, and started looking at the potential opportunity for policies to reduce methane emissions around the world. It was a slow time in the development of methane policies for a long time, but things have really started to kick off now. Just in the last few years, we've seen enormous amount of momentum created to address methane emissions at the subnational level, at the national level. Some of the bigger events in the last few years were the North American Leaders Summit, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, in 2016 between Canada, Mexico, and the US. The efforts at the state levels to regulate methane emissions, as well as the provincial levels in Canada to regulate methane emissions. And then more recently, we've seen in Europe the launch of the European Methane Strategy. And just this year, we've seen Colombia and Nigeria with proposed standards out. In fact, I think Colombia's proposed regulations closed for public comment today. So it's super exciting to see all of the momentum moving in this direction to address methane emissions. Of course, this is largely driven by the ever-growing attention that is the spotlight that's being shown on methane's impact, as well as the opportunity. Alice mentioned the global methane assessment, which shows us the opportunity for methane emission reductions, giving us the opportunity to keep the 1.5 degree goal of Paris within reach. But just recently, also, the IPCC showed us just how big the impact of methane emissions is on our climate, contributing 0.5 degree of warming that we are currently feeling today. So I think, this spotlight on both how big of a problem this is, but also the opportunity that methane presents is why nations around the world are increasingly paying more attention to this. We're here, though, of course, to talk about oil and gas, and I think the Global Methane Assessment also does a really great job of giving us a sense of what's necessary from different sectors in order to keep 1.5 degrees in reach. In the fossil fuels sector, the Global Methane Assessment calls for at least a 60% global reduction in emissions from fossil fuels. That's coal, oil, and gas by 2030 in order to keep the 1.5 degree target within reach. We've seen a lot of high-level political engagement on methane this year, but not commitments yet. The Leaders Summit on Climate in March, methane was referred to by several countries in their speeches. Russia, Argentina, and France and several other nations spoke about the need to reduce methane emissions. At the G7 and the G20, the communiques coming out of those ministerial meetings mentioned the need to do something more about methane emissions. We've seen the creation of the International Methane Emissions Observatory by UNEP and the EU, which will hopefully bring a lot more coalescence of the science and the emissions data around this issue so that everyone has a better understanding of the full breadth of the problem. And then we've also seen the UK COP leadership call for action on methane at this year's COP26 in November. All of this is kind of setting the stage for hopefully a much bigger political engagement, high-level political engagement from nations, either on an individual basis or a collective basis as we go forward through the rest of this year. I'm kind of harping on this high-level political engagement piece for a reason, and that's based on our experience as an organization working on this issue for a long time. In 2016, three gentlemen there on the bottom, Peña Nieto from Mexico, Trudeau from Canada, and Obama from the United States, they got together at what's called the North American Leaders Summit and agreed to reduce methane emissions from the oil and gas sector by 40 to 45%. Unless you were hanging out in Mexico City or Ottawa or Washington D.C. at the time, it's really hard to conceptualize how big of a change this was in all three capitals at the time when this agreement was signed. What it did is it really opened the door for the regulators in those nations to move aggressively forward to address methane emissions. We were doing a small little project in Mexico. Actually, Alfredo was working for the Mexican government at that time and was our partner there. We were doing a small little project in Mexico, but the second that Peña Nieto signed that agreement, the doors were open wide to really take on the methane issue in Mexico. And in just a couple of years, Mexico had developed a really strong set of regulations that Dora is going to talk about here. Well, and Canada also has moved forward with really strong regulations there as well. We would have Canada on this call, but unfortunately they're in an election and they're not allowed to engage in these types of collaborations during the election period. So James Diamond from Environment and Climate Change Canada sends his regrets. He wishes he could be here. This commitment and what this did to really open the door for the regulators to do what they wanted to do to reduce methane emissions, this is the kinds of things that we see as playing a critical role in other nations in allowing them to move forward with policies to reduce methane emissions. It gives the freedom to the regulators to do what they need to do, and that's a critical aspect of what we're hoping to see this year and next year. We've already seen some really exciting things. Nigeria, Asmau will talk a lot more about this, but Nigeria has been stepping up to tackle methane emissions from the oil and gas sector. Back in 2019, Nigeria and Cote d'Ivoire joined the Global Methane Alliance. They were the first two nations to join the Global Methane Alliance and pledged to cut their emissions by 45% by 2025, 60 to 75% by 2030. Nigeria then went on to take those targets and incorporate them into their NDC that was just submitted recently to the Paris Climate Accords to enshrine their goal of slashing methane emissions by 60% by 2031. And they're now working on the policies that would be the implementing policies for those targets. But again, that setting of that goal and that high-level commitment to reductions open the door for the Environment Ministry and the Department of Petroleum Resources and the Ministry of Petroleum in Nigeria to come together and create a process by which they develop the policies to implement these things. So that's I don't want to take up too much more time. I just wanted to talk a little bit about, on this kind of pathway to a regulatory regime, the importance of this this high-level political commitment. And now we're going to hear more from folks that are on the ground right now working on policies to reduce methane emissions. Let's see, hold on, let me stop sharing my screen. If I can figure out how to do that, my apologies. Somebody just stopped me sharing my screen, so that's great. So let's see, next we have Asmau Jibril. She is the Chief Scientific Officer with the Federal Ministry of Environment in Nigeria. And oh, there she is. Hi, Asmau. How are you doing? Asmau is a wonderful person, and we've been collaborating with her for a number of years now in Nigeria. And it's great to see you. I wish this was in person. It's been a very long time, but it's great to see you. And I turn the floor to you, Asmau. Uh-oh, looks like we have maybe a technical difficulty there with Asmau. Let's see. Maybe we should go to Dora. Let's see, Asmau's still showing us off, I think. Dora, are you ready? Dora, can you hear us?
Yes.
Oh, there you are.
Yes.
Okay. Dora, if you're ready to go, I think we can go to you first, and then we'll come back to Asmau. Dora is also a longtime friend. We've worked with her in Mexico for many years. She's the General Director at ASEA, which is the Agency for Safety, Energy, and Environment. Oh, Asmau's back now. Okay,
sorry,
let's go back to Asmau then.
I'm sorry about that. It just went off. The internet just went off. So
okay.
I can go on now? Okay.
Okay, go ahead then, Asmau. The floor is yours.
Please.
Asmau, we can't hear you. Okay, let's try to go, Dora. Let's go with you then. Sorry, folks, about the technical difficulties here. Dora, if you are ready, Dora is the General Director at ASEA, which is the regulator for the oil and gas industry in Mexico, and she was one of the lead authors of Mexico's regulatory policy that was finalized in 2018. Dora, if you're ready to go, the floor is yours.
I think you might be muted, Dora. We can see your slides though.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Yes, thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. On behalf of Mr. Ángel Carrizales Lopez, Executive Director of the Agency for Energy, Safety and Environment in Mexico, I thank the organizers for the kind invitation to participate in this event. The presentation will address, yes, thank you. The presentation will address 5 points that you can see in this slide that we hope you find of use and of interest while you, if you are interested in starting the journey to draft and implement a regulation of in the control of methane emissions. Mexico's commitment to regulate methane has 3 milestones. The first is the General Law on Climate Change. The second is the Paris Agreement. And the third, as Jonathan will refer to, the North American Leaders Summit that had a result of a statement on a North American climate, clean energy, and environment partnership, where a commitment was established to reduce methane emissions between 40 and 45%. So being a regulator body entitled to control polluting emissions, it received a clear mandate to regulate the control of methane emissions. So ASEA expects that with this regulatory piece, we can contribute so Mexico can achieve its international and regional pledges and goals. The regulation was written aligned to best practices and in a risk-based approach. Also, it's focused to control the main sources of methane emissions, and to do that, it is structured, as you can see in the slide, as a continuous improvement cycle. And it establishes that a diagnosis has to be made by the regulated, it is the industry, and the diagnosis comprises the identification of emissions at the level of, in each facility, at the level of equipment and components, and the classification of emissions. It is to identify them from venting, flaring, and leaking, and also to quantify them, to establish a base year, and taking that year, start to reducing emissions. It also establishes to the regulated or the industry a self-declared mitigation goal to be achieved in 6 years. One of the important aspects of the regulation in Mexico is that it distinguishes between new and existing facilities, because we know not all of them have the same structures or the same processes. Therefore, depending of if it is classified as a new or an existing facility, the regulated has to implement a program to control emissions. And the program is comprised by, as I said, best practices that are included. The regulation has a broad scope, a broad range of best practices that have proven to be efficient in reducing emissions from the hydrocarbon sector. Then, the regulated has also to implement a leak detection and repair program every in a quarterly basis, which will be help them to reduce emissions. While we were writing the regulatory piece, we acknowledged that the leak detection and repair program was fundamental, because you already, as you may know, emissions from leaking might not be present at a time, but while the operations take place, may appear. So this program is a fundamental piece within the regulation of Mexico. Then it also comprises diagnosis and verification, internal and external, and to prove that they are regulators are complying with the regulation, they have to carry on internal audits as well as external audits. External audits are carried on by what we call in ASEA third parties that are authorized by the agency. So it is in a wide scale or wide it works, how our regulation is done. And we now are in the implementing phase. So it is important for us to highlight some challenges we have faced in this while implementing this regulatory piece. Here you can see the timeline. As you can see, the regulation was published on November the 6th, and it took entry into force on November 7, 2018. I might say that the regulatory piece was submitted to public consultation from October to 2018 to November, sorry, to August 2018 to November 2018. We received more than 550 comments, and as a first time in the agency, 10 letters of national and international bodies supporting Mexico's regulatory piece. It was very important for us, and still is important for us, because it pushed more the importance to regulate this greenhouse gas. So as I said, the verification is done by third parties, but the first challenge while implementing the regulatory piece we faced was to authorize third parties. So we have to issue an amendment to the regulatory piece in June 29, 2020, to allow more time to authorize third parties. This amendment to the regulatory piece established that in June 2021, we have to start receiving the first programs verified by the third party. And in September 2021, the first technical inspection report with Elder could be carried on. And we expect in June 2022 to receive the first programs, the first annual reports. And then another challenge we're facing is still with third parties, because it is what we call a transversal regulatory piece, because it covers the entire value chain of the hydrocarbon sector, except retail. But for interested people or organizations wanting to be third parties, we found that it was difficult to understand the way we structure the call for third parties. So another challenge we faced is meeting the requirements of the call for third parties, especially because it was a new regulatory piece. It hadn't been regulated in Mexico before. So meeting the requirements on expertise for the two figures, the technical expert and the technical responsible, was a challenge. And also the proper filling of the forms to make all the requirements to be approved. So we have to convey, or this led us to convey, 2 workshops, one in September last year, and the other of September was at the national level, and other at the international level, March in this year, to share with all interested parties the need that we have to have these third parties that can audit or that can emit the opinion, so we make sure that the regulated are complying with this regulatory piece. So now we have, fortunately, one authorized third party for segment 8. You can see in the screen. Segment A comprises exploration and extraction of hydrocarbons, and also we have one third party that has been authorized for the whole value of the whole chain of the hydrocarbon sector, which comprises exploration and extraction, the treatment and refining, storage of oil, and the processing, compression, liquefaction, decompression, and regasification, as well as pipeline transportation, storage, and distribution of natural gas. And we also have two more interested parties in evaluation, and that we hope they will receive the authorization if all goes well. But this has represented a real challenge for us because, as I said, it's a new issue, and although there are many people interested, because this represents an opportunity not only for us to have people verifying that the regulation is implemented, but also for all those who want to explore new ways of business, because this covers the whole hydrocarbon chain. But we also are still in wanting these interested parties to become a third party of the agency. So I take the opportunity in this event to extend an invitation if you know, or if you could be interested in participating as a third party of the agency to contribute to this real challenge that imposes the control of methane emissions. And also wanted to talk briefly, share with you some final thoughts that are hand in hand with what Jonathan talked about, because we believe that political commitment to mitigate methane emissions is essential. In having that commitment from our political leaders, it's essential. So as a regulatory body, it's necessary to have an effective and legal framework that also not only has an impact on this control of emissions to tackle climate change, but also in sustainable development. Because as you well know, if we contribute to tackling emissions, we also contribute to avoid the catastrophic effects that climate change imposes. Moreover, in those vulnerable countries or vulnerable places within countries. And the regulator must have a clear mandate, transparent means of reporting. For the agency, it was as I said, a clear mandate because we have it by law, but we find it that it's useful to have this clear mandate to act and to propose all the regulatory measures that will finally lead to an effective reduction of methane emissions. Also, we find that the participation of decision makers should be encouraged while drafting regulation and while implementing the regulation. Because as I said, our regulation, for example, is based on a continuous improvement cycle. So the feedback that we receive from the regulated as well as from third parties would be vital for us to detect what areas of opportunity could be improved in the next years. Also, some flexibility is required to implement best practices and review the regulation, considering the results of its implementation, and also including, as I said, the feedback of regulated and third parties. It also is required to have sufficient and finite resources to incorporate technologies and tools in the inspection or audit of the implementation of the regulation. This is important, and we also are facing this challenge because receiving such amount of data of the program and the implementation report is demanding from the agency to have a broad database or broad tools that will help us to manage all that, to be able to produce numbers and to produce results that are available to the interested public, to see how well the country and the regulators of the hydrocarbon sector are doing with to comply with this regulation. Also, it is required to have sufficient and final resources on data analysis, the systematization of data, the creation of databases, and the performance indicators. So we can have, or we could have the track of how we are doing, not also to enact, to make it to enforceable, but also for those who have to comply with it. So I hope this will be of use to you, and I am open to your comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dora. That was fantastic, and given us a lot to think about. I especially like that last slide on the thoughts and the reflections that you have on the process, and having spent a lot of time working with you and your team. I think those are wonderful reflections on the process. And I think one of the things that I like the most is the goal of continuous improvement. And I think this space is one of those things where we're not looking at putting out one set of policies and saying, okay, we're done. This is something where we need to be learning constantly and improving what we're doing to try to get emissions as close to zero as absolutely possible. And I think that that goal of continuous improvement in the policy and the performance space is critical. Also, the piece on data and the ability to monitor and audit the performance. I think that's such a critical piece that we often overlook. It's on the far backside of policy development. It's the implementation phase, and we tend to not pay a whole lot of attention as we're developing policy to that implementation phase. And I think that is something that policymakers really need to look at as they're going through this process of how these things are going to be implemented. Do we have the resources for this? What more do we need in order to be able to do this properly? Things like how data is going to be reported, where it's going to be even entered, things like that. It is it's not the pretty fun part of policy development. It's kind of the gritty, ugly part of policy development, but it's absolutely critical. And I think you've done a really good job of illuminating that for us. So thank you. I want to come back to Asmau hopefully now, and maybe Asmau, you can leave your video screen off. Maybe that will help on that side. But I will turn the floor to you, Asmau, if you are ready. Asmau, can you hear us?
Yes,
Okay.
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Great. Yes, we can. Thank you. The floor is yours,
I'm
Asmau.
sorry about my internet. Sorry about that. So I'm going to give the Nigerian example, and I'll start now. Can we go to the, sorry, I'm not sharing my screen, so I need someone to be moving the screens for me. So this is the outline. We can go to the next page, which is the overview of Nigeria's oil and gas sector, which comprises of the upstream, midstream, and downstream, and the emissions cut across the entire value chain from upstream to downstream. And the government has majorly focused on elimination of the gas flare, and it's still in progress. And there are several policies and measures to tackle flaring in the country. And the government is working towards ending gas flaring in 2030. This is reflected in our NDC. It's one of the key measures under the oil and gas sector. Methane emissions is another area the government has shown interest in recent years. And with more activities on gas utilization, the fugitive methane reduction has become a major focus also in the country. Next, please. So you can see that from 2000, I mean, the gas flaring has been very successful in it's been reduced significantly up to 2018, having the lowest in 2016 and a slight increase in 2018. But we can see that the policies and measures by government have been effective in driving down this flare. And gas flaring has reduced by 70% from the year 2000 level. So these policies are expected to increase flare reduction and take, hopefully take Nigeria out of the list of the top gas flaring nations, which we're, I can see, halfway on that. And with the success in this reduction in gas flaring, the government is now working on to address the fugitive methane. Next, please. This is a graph of the gas flaring countries. Nigeria used to be the second from the highest side, and you can see how we have come down to be number 7 on the list, as in number 7 being down from on the reduction side. And we are still working on that to see that we go to the lowest that we can. If it can also be 0, that's our target, 0 gas flaring by 2030. Next, please. So our journey in addressing the methane emissions. Yes, we all know that addressing methane emission is now a global concern. So the issues we're facing here is lack of domestic data on fugitive methane to base quantitative estimates. Also, some various baselines and forecasts exist on methane emission in the country. However, most of these estimates are based on information from international studies. There's also high level of uncertainty in use of this international data. And there's lack of in-country experts and technology to quantify this methane emissions. And we don't have any policy or regulation to address methane emissions, though we're now working on it. Next, please. So these are the list of efforts that we're working on to address fugitive methane. We joined the CCAC in 2012. Of course, methane is one of the short-lived climate pollutants, so that's one of our focus. And we developed a national action plan to reduce these short-lived climate pollutants in 2019. And we have begun engagement with the oil and gas stakeholders on the need to address this methane. So we've conducted several workshops to build capacity amongst these stakeholders, and we've been working with the CATF, the country regulator, which is DPR, Department of Petroleum Resources, and Carbon Limits Nigeria. We've developed a baseline for fugitive methane using the COMAT and identified some mitigation measures to address methane emissions. There was a training for stakeholders on the use of the COMAT, and some companies are already making efforts to address methane within their facilities. And there's ongoing work towards the development of country methane regulations. We're working on guidelines for that. Next, please. So several stakeholders and to develop baseline and mitigation targets for inclusion in the revision of our NDC, which we've already, the NDC has been revised and submitted. And, yes, we have a target in that. I'll get to that in my presentation. And we've conducted various sessions on best practices for methane emission reductions in the sector. We've also included a 60% methane reduction targets by 2031 in the revised NDC, like I just mentioned now. And this was done after due consultation and buy-in from the stakeholders. Yes, the NDC has been approved and submitted to the revised NDC has been approved and submitted to the UNFCCC, and we have steps to develop policy to reduce methane emissions in the sector now on track. As a first step, the Ministry of Environment is working with the DPR, the CATF, and carbon limits, and we have developed a guideline required to address methane in the sector, and this is currently undergoing stakeholder review. Next, please. So, sorry. The challenges we're facing in developing these policies or regulations is that we understand that addressing methane takes time and could be difficult to achieve in the short term. But developing a policy to address methane takes time, but use of a guideline would be achieved in a relative shorter period. But this can leave gaps because in guidelines, it's not really, well, it's something that the stakeholders can take up, but of course there's a lack of severity of penalties, though it's a low-hanging fruit, and it's easier to address methane in this part of the globe. So since we know that the pandemic has impacted on so many things, so this sector is also impacted by the COVID-19, and without the right incentive, adhering to the guideline could be a tall order for some stakeholders. So technical expertise in actualizing leak detection and repair in the country is also much early in the early stages, and the aggressiveness expected to address fugitive methane may not be witnessed quickly. Next, please. So we expect that there will be awareness on the need to address fugitive methane, and we need to ensure that the guideline is finalized and receives the right support from the stakeholders, improvement in guideline, and the emergence of policy regulation on methane for the sector. We also expect a more aggressive effort within the sector operators to reduce methane, and increase technical and technological support to enhance achieving methane reduction among stakeholders. The sector stakeholders, introduction and implementation of the LDAR program by all stakeholders in the sector as technical capacity is built. And also we expect that we achieve the 60% methane reduction target by 2031 in Nigeria, which is of course in our revised NDC. So next, please. So to conclude, we need to know that the issue of addressing methane, it's in its early stage, like I said earlier, and is receiving the right attention. We have all the most of the stakeholders on board, all the government stakeholders on board, and of course the private sector as well. But we think that it's going in the right direction. And previously efforts has been on addressing flaring, and now we have about 70% reduction from the 2000 levels. The government is committed also to addressing its GHG emissions, especially as it relates to methane reduction in the oil and gas sector by building on its success from flaring. Work is ongoing to finalize the developed guideline that will help to provide a sense of direction for all the stakeholders and best practice measures needed to address methane. Capacity is also being built among stakeholders to increase awareness on fugitive methane and ensure buy-in in the developed baseline and mitigation target by these sectors. So the government is working closely with the stakeholders to ensure that this target, as included in the revised NDC, is achieved. Next, please. So this is just a backup. These are some of the policies and regulations that we have in Nigeria. We have the Global Gas Flare Reduction Partnership and the Zero Routine Flaring, which was we joined in 2016. And we have the Nigerian Gas Flare Commercialization Program, also 2016. The National Gas Policy was adopted in June 2017, the gas flare regulation in 2018. And of course, we have a whole list of other, we have our NDC, which has a commitment to gas flare out by 2030 and the reduction in methane emissions by 2031. So can we go to the next page, please? So this is just a screenshot from our revised NDC, and the last part of the last 2 lines of this page is the oil and gas sector, which has the zero gas flaring by 2030 and 60% reduction in fugitive emissions by 2031. So thank you. This is the end of my presentation.
Great, thank you so much, Asmau. It was really good to hear Nigeria's experience in developing their policies to address methane emissions, and I think you know, the success that Nigeria has had in reducing flaring is often overlooked, and I think when I first started looking into the huge impact that Nigeria has had in reducing flaring, I was quite impressed, and I'm excited by Nigeria's efforts to take those successful experiments and turn them towards reducing methane emissions. And I think you touched on a couple of really important things, the need for building capacity. We've definitely seen that as a critical piece of developing policy, and that capacity has to be built in multiple places. We've seen the need for building capacity within the stakeholders in the oil and gas companies. Also, it's often critical to build out the capacity within the ministries and the agencies that are going to be responsible for developing the policies to reduce methane. There's often a relatively small team inside ministries that have a really good handle on methane emissions. But it's important as you go into these phases of developing policy to have a much broader team that can handle the issues as they are being developed. And then I think the other piece that you touched on that's very critical is finding global cooperation to build out the team that can help in developing both the capacity as well as policy ideas and help you overcome any barriers that you are seeing as you do develop policies. And I think that's one of the great things that the CCAC and other organizations like the CCAC bring to this space is the ability to connect with policymakers and experts from around the world that can help facilitate movement on policy development in your own country. So I think that's fantastic. Next, we're going to turn to Tomas from the IEA. Tomas is an energy and environmental policy analyst at IEA. If you have not seen all the fantastic stuff that IEA has been putting together on methane, I strongly urge you to go to their website to dig in deep on what they've done. They've done a fantastic job of taking some very complex things and putting them into a form that makes it so much more understandable and user-friendly. And they keep adding new elements on a regular basis. So I'm really excited that Tomas is here with us today and can talk about some of the tools and resources that they have developed to help countries develop policies to mitigate methane. So Tomas, I turn to you. The floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jonathan. Can you all hear me well?
Yes, we can.
Great, great to be part of this event and to be talking about methane. I have the feeling that we talk a lot about methane, but we don't do that enough still. And I think you hit some good points when you started your presentation about the importance of turning to this short-lived climate pollutant. And before I start talking a little bit more about the EIA's work on the different tools and resources for oil and gas methane regulation, I just wanted to point out that we've seen some examples from Mexico, from Nigeria, of the process that comes along with developing methane regulation, and it's certainly a challenging one. Policymakers and the executive bodies, the agencies, they have to go into this nitty-gritty work of making sure that that the regulation comes along through and it's correctly implemented. And there's all these different challenges that we've heard about, and I think we're going to have to talk a little bit more about. But I just wanted to point out that there are many different initiatives that offer support for regulators that want to act on methane. TIA is one of them, but we've heard about the Global Methane Alliance. There's also the Global Methane Initiative. There's the Oil and Gas Methane Partnership. We've got the Methane Guiding Principle Group and several others. So even if some amount of the work and the challenges will fall on regulators, it's important to have in mind that there are a lot of people out there that can help. So with that, let me turn a bit more to the work of the IEA. And just to highlight that tackling methane emissions is really a key opportunity for clean energy transitions, and it's been a long-standing topic of IEA analysis. Here you can see some of the publications that we've released on the topic, including the 3 major publications that came out this year. I'm going to talk a little bit more about each one of them. The Methane Tracker, which provides our best estimates for country-level oil and gas methane emissions. The Regulatory Roadmap and Toolkit, which is a detailed how-to guide for policymakers and regulators seeking to cut these emissions. And the Roadmap to Net Zero by 2050, which provides a bit of the context and highlighted the need for action on methane in the path to this ambitious scenario. So first of all, the Net Zero Roadmap. This is similar to the IEA's Sustainable Development Scenario, and it shows a drop of 75% in methane emissions within the coming decade. About a third of this decline is a result of an overall reduction in fossil fuel consumption, but the larger share comes from a huge increase in the deployment of emission reduction measures and technologies, leading to the elimination of all technically avoidable methane emissions by 2030. So this is really where we provide the context for methane action in clean energy transitions and what kind of ambition is necessary for us to reach these kind of goals. And as you can see, there's really a challenging way ahead. Overall, we estimate that about 70 million tons of methane were emitted to the atmosphere from oil and gas operations in 2020. And the coal sector added about 40 million tons to that total. Now, this represents well above total energy sector emissions from the whole of the European Union. And it's really a huge opportunity for climate change mitigation. Now, the Methane Tracker, it outlines the measures that can be taken to tackle these emissions. And as a broad number, it indicates that about 3/4 of oil and gas emissions can be abated with existing technology. And a good part of this can come at no net cost by implementing simple measures such as leak detection and repair programs, which we've heard about today. Now, the exact share varies depending on gas prices. It's been 40%, 10%, 30%, but what is important is that to have in mind it's really, really cost effective when you compare to other actions on climate change. So tackling methane is really low-hanging fruit in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. But as we've been talking about, and we'll have the opportunity to talk about more in a bit, we need effort to fulfill the entire abatement potential you see here on the screen. Governments really need to step up policy efforts, with methane regulations driving early action and performance improvements, while considering the means of enforcement, the possibility of innovation in methane management, and several other challenges. But existing policy tools that have been tested and tried and found success in many contexts, such as equipment mandates or reporting requirements or leak detection and repair programs, they can really enable better information and measurement data and pave the way, drive early reductions, and then enable further reductions from more flexible regulations in the future. Now, to help policymakers and regulators down this path, we've developed a step-by-step guide. This is the methane regulatory roadmap and toolkit. We started by taking a broad survey of existing regulations across the world, and the results of this can be found in our policies database, which now includes entries from over 50 global jurisdictions. And the two key components of this publication are the roadmap, which outlines the process for implementation and unfolds in three distinct phases you can see on the screen here. Information gathering, then defining, developing, and drafting regulations, and then a focus on implementation, including measures on compliance and processes to review and adapt policies over time. And the second part is the toolkit, which describes the various policy and regulatory tools that jurisdictions can use to address methane emissions, including prescriptive or command and control requirements, performance-based requirements, economic instruments, and information-based instruments. As I've said, there are several organizations providing support for regulators in this space, such as the IEA, UNEP, and many NGOs. For our part, we are offering to work with individual jurisdictions to provide more targeted assistance in working through this roadmap and toolkit. And we also seek to partner with other organizations in certain cases when we can then mobilize additional or complementary resources that we may not be able to provide on our own. But that's what I had very quickly. I'd be glad to expand in any of the subjects that I touched upon, as we've got very rich material on each one of those topics. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tomas. That was fantastic. Never paid so much attention to IEA as I have now that you guys have all of this stuff up on the website. I use your tools on a regular basis to help me with processes that we're working on in different parts of the world. So it's really great to have you guys and all of the brain power at IEA working on this issue. It's absolutely fantastic. Next, we have our panel discussion where we're going to be answering questions. On the agenda, we have the panel discussion and then Brendan talking at the end. Brendan, I didn't know if you want to switch that around and talk before the panel discussion, and then we just do Q&As for the panel discussion at the end, or how you want to do that. You have a preference, Brendan?
I don't have a preference. You wanted to hear about the international side of the work and what's going on there. I can do that in the panel or at the end, as you wish.
Why don't you start there, and then we can go into the Q&A, because there's a bunch of stuff starting to pop up in the questions. But why don't you go ahead, and then we'll jump in and have question and answer.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for all the other interventions and for your timeline that you presented at the beginning. Indeed, there's one thing missing on it, which was that the 1996, the European Commission released its first methane strategy, which led to a reduction of methane emissions from waste by up to 50% in the European Union. I say that only to underline that with good policy and dedication, these things can be done. And although the methane policy of the 1990s in the European Union led to a reduction of methane emissions by 50%, it wasn't primarily for climate reasons, it was for environment reasons more generally. But it does show that with good policy and political will, we can do these things. Internationally, we have to do these things now, and we have to deliver in a very short time frame up till 2030. The global methane assessment has shown the way. We need to cover two sets of methane emissions, one which comes from lifestyle changes, which is perhaps more difficult. But the other area, which is the area we've been discussing today, are the things that we can do practically in the oil, gas, and coal sectors, and also in other areas which have very low or no costs whatsoever. The European Commission set out last year, in October 2020, its views that we should have an international framework for methane reductions up until 2030. We now have the figures that are coming from the global methane assessment. We would like to see that put into some sort of international framework, and we've reached out to a lot of allies around the world on this point in recent months, and we're reasonably hopeful that something will be in preparation or will be delivered by COP26 or indeed by the G20 Leaders Summit in November. What is the content of all of that? Well, the overriding issue we see is implementation and action, and we don't want to have further discussions about what it is that we are doing. We want to see ways of having it done. The things that we ought to have done, both domestically within the European Union, but elsewhere internationally. You've mentioned some of them. Leak detection and repair should become mandatory. There should be mandatory measurement reporting and verification. There should be the validation and comparison of results. Validation, I think, is extremely important and something that has been overlooked in the past. We would like to see the incorporation of methane emissions into supply indexes, which indicate where methane is being emitted and who is responsible, whether it's be a country, a field, a company, whomever should be held responsible for it, underlining the principle of the polluter pays. We should also see that there is a recognition that there are different costs and different prices for these issues in different countries. When we're talking about agriculture, we cannot assume that the agricultural livestock of North America or Western Europe should be considered the same as the agricultural livestock of Africa or Southeast Asia. The social role of animals in those areas is very different. And the same is true also of delivering energy to that part of the global community which doesn't have access to ready energy today. And so there has to be a global recognition of the justness of what we are trying to do. We need to have some sort of target. The target that set out in the global methane assessment is very good, but we need to find a way of attributing that to sectors, companies and sectors, countries, and others. And that needs to be updated over time. A very clear role here that we need to establish also is of the International Methane Emissions Observatory, which will be able to give us clear numbers which cannot be argued with, about the context and emissions around the world. And I think that is something that we will put a significant emphasis on both within the European Union and with our global partners in the future. So there is every prospect that something will be delivered this year. I'm very optimistic about the achievement of something. I'm less optimistic about the achievement of something that is truly going to change the circumstances in which we see methane emissions today. And there we need concerted action from civil society, from third countries, and from everybody on this call to make sure that there is a global framework which will hold countries and communities like the European community to account for the emissions that they are responsible for. We need to keep pushing. The Clean Air Task Force and others have been very, very good at pushing forward the agenda on methane in the past few years. I wish you every success for the future, but I need to make sure, or we all need to make sure, that by the end of this year, we have a very good international agreement which has clear targets and clear attribution of responsibilities and duties for the future. That's a very quick overview, Jonathan. Back to you.
No, I like the charge there at the end, Brendan. Couldn't agree more. And I'm hoping for success from all of the parties that are working towards that goal. So I think that will be critical in setting the stage for the kinds of reductions we need in order to be able to keep 1.5 degrees within reach, which is the goal of this year's COP, is to keep 1.5 within reach. We have a lot of work to get there, and I think methane can play a critical role in that. We have reached the section of today's program where we're going to be going through doing question and answer with all of the members of the panel here. I'm going to be looking over here to the side because I had to blow up the chat and the Q&A because you guys aren't following the rules. You're putting your questions in the chat and the Q&A, which makes it a little more difficult, but I will dig through these and try to direct these as much as I can to folks. Some of the questions have already been answered. Thank you to those folks that are answering it. Brendan, you had a question on what is COMAT. I'll take that one quickly. COMAT is the country methane abatement tool. It's a model that we developed to facilitate a better understanding of methane emissions. It's built on an open source platform that allows everyone to see all of the assumptions in it and to change the assumptions based on their own country parameters. It's not something that you simply grab and go work on. It's kind of a process as much as anything. But if folks are interested in learning more, I'd be happy to talk about that. Denise dropped into the chat a section on our website that goes into more details on that. And it's something that we're currently working with Ecuador on, as well as Colombia, Nigeria, and we've been doing some work, a little bit of work in Argentina as well, utilizing the tool. But happy to talk more about that at some point. Let me see. The Han Ling had a question for Dora, but it looks like Dora answered it. Han Ling's question was who pays for the third-party audits in Mexico, and Dora answered that one, that industry pays for those. Let's see, I'm looking through the chat for the additional questions. Let's see, here's one from Daniel. Daniel had a question about to all of the state governments, or the national governments represented here. He's looking for folks to talk about the difficulties that they may have faced in country where environment ministries are often more likely to be in a position to wanting to take on the development of policies and energy ministries may not be in the same position. I wonder if any of the countries represented would be willing to talk towards how they overcame some of those issues, or how they're trying to overcome some of those issues.
Can I go?
Yes, please.
Okay, so in Nigeria, we have the Interministerial Committee on Climate Change, where these ministries work together on climate change issues. And we have clear rules that we play. What policies go to what ministries. So if it's oil and gas ministries, that have to do a policy on the oil and gas. Those are ministries on, well, it's a one ministry with other agencies that work on that policy. Though some are cross-cutting, like reduction of methane. Yes, of course, the Ministry of Environment also has a role to play, and but is mostly on use of the data. But we know that, yes, the oil and gas sector are supposed to come up with that. So we have some clear, each ministry has its own clear mandate, but we work together to see that we support each other. Each of the ministries support each other to see that these policies go to the right places and have the right information that is supposed to be there. Thank you.
Thank you, Asmau. Dora, I didn't know if you want to make any comments on that question or not. If not, I can go to the next question. Yes? Okay.
It's a great question. I believe many of us go through this challenge. It's one of the first challenges. For ASEA was we are in the environment sector, so it was also a challenge at the beginning. But I believe that establishing a neutral space to get together both ministries, environment and energy, is going to be useful for those interested, and also to make sure that we are, as Mal said, we are not competing to see who has the right or the wrong answers. We are together in this as ministries, as countries, as the whole world. So there's a win, or a win-win, sorry, game here, because for the environment, it's good to reduce emissions to protect, but also in this neutral field, talking to the energy ministry and also the industry, as I mentioned, it's public consultations and international or national fora. For example, we have a value aid for CATF and EDF in the beginning of the writing the regulatory piece, conveying to the industry what were the good opportunities for them to reduce emissions, not only in terms of environment, but also in terms of economy, because avoiding these emissions to the atmosphere represents more money for them, because natural gas is going to be sold in the end, no? So if you avoid to flare or to bend or to leak, you are saving this important gas and avoiding the damage to the environment. So I believe it's a challenge, but it's not impossible. And also the technology, as the International Energy Agency and the Climate and Clean Air Coalition had published these documents are important, because it is already proved that the emissions can be done at a cost-effective manner, and there are a wide range of best practices that can be adopted without incurring in too much expenses. It depends on the facility. It depends whether you are in the hydrocarbon value chain. So, of course, it can be done. It's feasible and it's possible, and it's just trying to connect the win-win solutions for everyone. And of course, we'll have a good part to doing that. But I believe it's something that can be done, and I won't say it will occur in one day. It's a job that has to be done, and it has continuously to be done, because the public administration, for example, people go and left, and also in the industry. But this sense of urgency and this sense of everybody can do something to avoid this, it's taking more power. And I believe that we have to take this opportunity to go with it and enforce it as much as we can. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dora. Thank you, Asmau. That was a great answer on finding a way to overcome some of those institutional barriers that arise really in the earliest stages of the development of policy. And I think both of you have done a wonderful job of addressing those in your processes to develop policy. Let's see, moving on to other questions, and I'm just right now I'm going through the questions that are in the Q&A in the chat. If anyone wants to ask a question out loud, please raise your hand, and I'll get to you shortly. But continuing on with questions in the chat and Q&A, Ramesh has a question about OGMP and how it's linked with the global methane assessment. I'm not that, so the global methane assessment is looking at methane emissions and what is needed to reduce in different sectors of the economy to keep or to put the world on a path to meeting the 1.5 degree target. It doesn't really go into OGMP's reporting requirements and things like that. It's the global methane assessment isn't looking at that side of the policy aspects. It's looking really at what needs to happen as far as emission reductions in order for us to have a chance of hitting the 1.5 degree target. It doesn't go into what kinds of policies would be needed for reporting and measuring of emissions. But Brendan, I didn't know if you wanted to say a few words about OGMP, because I know that OGMP has been mentioned as a potential example of the reporting program that the European Commission is going to be looking at as they develop their own monitoring, reporting, and verification protocols. So I don't know if you want to say a few words about that.
Yeah, sure. Actually, I was looking earlier at the Clean Air Task Force. You made a tweet, I think, today, suggesting what should be in our European Union domestic legislation in November. And one of your recommendations was that we should require third countries to implement certain measures, such as leak detection and repair, or MRV, or any number of other things. Of course, our legislation can only be operative within the European Union, and so it's very difficult for us to require others to do things in the production phase of oil, gas, or coal as a condition to have access to the European Union. But one thing we can do is we can recognize international good practice and encourage it, and that's where the Oil and Gas Methane Partnership for us has a unique role. We played a strong hand in developing the OGMP 2.0 standard. We like it very much. It has very good data production, and the first results of that data production will be going to the International Methane Emissions Observatory as we speak, actually. The reason OGMP is helpful is that we can trust the numbers. So a company that wants to import LNG or anything else to the European Union, indeed plastics or any downstream product from a resource, from a fossil resource, can rely on the numbers and say, well, we have very low emissions associated with our LNG shipment or plastic shipment. And the thing is that OGMP we can trust, so we can say, yes, that's true, that that company is doing it in a certain way, and this we can trust their numbers. In a way, the opposite thing is the important point here, is that the other companies we can't trust, and other systems we can't trust. And I think that's the importance of the OGMP. Now, OGMP covers, I think, about 30% of global oil and gas production. In the United States, for example, it's about 10%. Some countries, it's 100%. The aim is to make sure that those countries and companies that adopt OGMP standards have a reduced resistance in accessing the European Union market, both for the primary resources that are being sent or for any derived goods that have been developed using those primary resources. This is a long-term strategy that we will be developing, which is designed to allow us to discriminate in the best possible sense between producers upon their environmental footprint. There may not be a huge change in our legislation or our stance this year, but over the long term, it's very clear what the direction is. OGMP is definitely part of the solution as we see it, or any other standards that will be developed from OGMP or in compatibility with OGMP. For example, we need something similar in agriculture. We need something similar in coal, but we are developing those right now. Does that answer your question, Jonathan?
No, that's very helpful. That's very helpful. But don't turn your camera off or your microphone, because the next one's coming to you as well. And others can comment on this as well. But there's also a question in here from Yasmin, looking at how countries are thinking about assessing emissions from LNG, from LNG shipping, from the processes to liquefy and move natural gas around the world. How are you looking at assessing and accounting for those emissions as you think about these longer term processes of trying to give preferential treatment to companies and shipments that are less methane intensive than others?
Well, the European Union has both pipeline and for natural gas or more fossil gas. We have pipeline and LNG shipments. Whatever basis we have should be comparable across the two methods into the European Union. They should, I think I mentioned already, assimilate emissions which should be attached to the product. One of the things that we have learned is that traditional life cycle analysis that have been proposed by many different countries tend to exclude emissions as a starting point. They say we are not responsible for this emission, so therefore we will not even include it in the base number for the life cycle analysis. And that is something that we want to clamp down on. We want to make it clear that the regulatory framework is to be addressed as much as the company's adaptation to the regulatory framework. So if, for example, a country says that it's okay to release methane in the period prior to commercial operation of a well, that methane should be associated with the end product, which is eventually coming from that well. It shouldn't be associated with the continual quotidian production point. And I think that's something that we will be working on. It's quite a difficult thing to do. And I know it's a bit of a cultural revolution, particularly in North America, to take responsibility for things that you traditionally haven't taken responsibility for. But I think it's coming as a concept. Traditional life cycle analysis, as I say, tend to exclude these things. We will be taking a much more broad vision of what a life cycle analysis is, and we will be making sure that all emissions are included in the life cycle analysis, potentially on the basis of country analysis or basin analysis or route analysis, but it will be transcending the traditional company-based life cycle analysis that we have seen up to date.
That's great. Thank you, Brendan. And with all the scientific studies and work that has gone on in the last 5 or so years on the emissions from the LNG cycle is one of the least studied areas, and so I think it's fantastic that you guys are going to be working to try to shine some light on that as well. Let me take one last question because I know we are already a few minutes over time. Let's see. Alberto has a question in here, and this talks a little bit about some of the comments that I was making following Dora's presentation about enforcement. Alberto is interested in what countries should be thinking about to enable good enforcement strategies after the policies are put in place. What are the kinds of things that countries need to be thinking about as they're putting together their policies so that they can have good enforcement of them? Because at the end of the day, it's emissions out of the air that we want, not just good policies on paper. And I wondered, Dora, I wondered if you might want to make a few comments on that.
Yes. As I mentioned, we are in the implementation phase, but we have not received yet the opinion of a third party with the program, with what we call the PPCIM. But we hope with this approval of these third parties, soon we will be receiving them. But a couple of thoughts on this important question are that if the Mexican regulations foresees or establishes for the regulated, when they do the diagnosis and the program, they establish a self-declared reduction target. It means it is not imposed as a global. We intended to do that, but we learned in the process that it would be or wouldn't be a good idea because it would maybe prevent them to achieve this global goal. So in the regulatory piece, we established that each facility or each regulated industry must establish a self-declared goal to be achieved in 6 years. So industry chooses what best practices are going to be implemented. It's also, as I said, it's for them to choose from the wide range of options, and depending on the facility and whether they are in the value chain to hydrocarbon sector. So they choose, so they have this flexibility, but also being a regulation, they have to comply with it. So once they have chosen what best practices are going to be implemented, they incorporate them to the program, to the PPCIM, as well as the leak detection and repair program, and the third party verifies that they are complying with it, and before they handing to the agency to comply with the regulation. And also, ASEA has the faculty by law to carry out inspections to be sure that both the third party did the job well, and also the regulated is complying with the regulation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dora. I think the enforcement piece is such a unique piece to every country, and I think one of the key things as nations are developing their policies is to understand what the capacity is for enforcement. You know, the capacity for enforcement in a place like California versus the capacity for enforcement in Mexico are very different. And I think Mexico recognized that going into that process, which is why they developed a system of third-party verification. But it's something that every nation is going to need to do at the beginning stages of the regulatory process, is to assess how these things will be enforced. I think the other thing to emphasize on this is that technologies are developing very rapidly to provide an even greater window onto enforcement and compliance with the coming launch of the new generation of satellites directing their attention towards methane. We already have a number of satellites right now that are bringing in tremendous information, but the next generation will be even better and provide greater coverage and regular coverage of the globe. And then technologies like aerial surveys and things like that that are changing the game as well. So I think the future of enforcement is going to be driven by a lot of the technological changes and progress that's being made there for sure. But it's important for countries to assess where they are at this time and how they'll deal with enforcement and if there's any sort of innovative elements that they need to develop. We've run out of time. My apologies, I'm a bad host. There are a few more questions in the chat and the Q&A. We will try to do written answers for folks on those questions. Apologies we couldn't get to them all. With that, I'm going to stop and turn to Denise for some closing remarks. And I thank you all for your attention and your engagement on this issue.
Thanks a lot, Jonathan. And I just want to thank all of the participants, the panelists, the speakers, and also Clean Air Task Force for co-organizing this with the Climate and Clean Air Coalition. As many of you know, a lot of you are partners to the CCAC. The CCAC has, paid lots of attention to mitigating SLCPs from the oil and gas sector since it was created. The CCAC was created in 2012, starting with the launch of the OGMP in 2014, which was later, updated to OGMP 2.0, and then supporting the methane science studies, as well as since 2017-18, peer-to-peer regulatory support together with the Clean Air Task Force and the Center for Clean Air Policy and UNEP. And also, it's also very important to emphasize that the CCAC has also been looking at reducing black carbon from the oil and gas sector. And now that we have approved our 2030 strategy last year, the partners of the coalition are also in the final stages of developing the engagement strategy for the fossil fuel sector. So it's oil and gas, but also looking at opportunities from coal mines. So I just want to reiterate the call for interest and partnerships from from all governments, from national and subnational governments, from NGOs and from international organizations, as well as the private sector, to collaborate with the coalition partners as we elevate methane at the highest possible level towards COP26 and in the coming years. So methane has been really identified as a real important priority for coalition partners. And if you'd like to learn more and be involved in that collaboration, please feel free to contact the Climate and Cleaner Coalition Secretariat. So I'll end there and not take everyone's time. Again, I thank you, Jonathan, for facilitating this webinar. We also have more webinars to come on methane. And in fact, for this specific topic on regulations and country experiences in the oil and gas sector, we're aiming to do a second part that's closer to the date of the COP. So stay tuned for that. And thank you also to Alfredo, who's been working behind the scenes, as well, again, as to all of the panelists and speakers for your contributions. And we rely on your continued collaboration with the CCAC in this front. Thank you so much. And I'd like to wish everyone a good evening, good afternoon, good night for some, perhaps. That's all from me. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, Denise. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.